Sarah Martinez had always been invisible. Even in the military, where everyone was supposed to be equal, she found herself fading into the background like morning mist on the mountains. At 24, she had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, and it had become her specialty both in life and in her role as a backup sniper. The ridge overlooking the valley was cold that morning, with frost clinging to the rocks like tiny diamonds. Sarah lay flat against the granite, her rifle positioned but not engaged, watching through her scope as the primary sniper, Sergeant Kelly, adjusted his position 15 feet to her left. This was how it always went. Kelly would take the shot, Kelly would get the recognition, and Sarah would pack up her gear and follow behind like a shadow. She had grown up in a small town in Colorado where being the middle child of 5 meant mastering the skill of invisibility early. Her older brothers were the athletes, her younger sisters were the beauties, and Sarah was just there. Good enough grades to avoid attention, quiet enough to slip through family dinners unnoticed, unremarkable enough that teachers sometimes forgot her name even halfway through the school year. The military had seemed like a chance to reinvent herself, to become someone who mattered. But, even here, surrounded by people who were supposed to judge her only on merit, she found herself relegated to the background. Not because she lacked skill, her marksmanship scores were consistently higher than Kelly's, her patience was legendary among the unit, and her ability to remain motionless for hours was something even the veterans admired. But Kelly had charisma, confidence, and, most importantly, he had never doubted that he deserved to be center stage. The valley below stretched out like a green carpet, dotted with small villages that looked like toys from their elevated position. Intelligence had reported enemy movement in the area, and their unit had been positioned on 3 different ridges to provide overwatch for the patrol moving through the valley floor. Sarah's ridge was considered the least important, which was why they'd only stationed 2 snipers there instead of the usual 3-person team. Through her earpiece, she could hear the chatter from the other positions. Alpha Team had visual on suspicious movement near the eastern village. Bravo Team was tracking what appeared to be civilians, but the behavior was inconsistent. Charlie Team, her team, had nothing to report. Kelly was getting restless, shifting slightly every few minutes, which was exactly the kind of movement that could give away their position. Sarah's scope was trained on a different section of the valley, an area that the mission briefing had mentioned only briefly. There was an old monastery there, supposedly abandoned, but something about the shadows near the building kept catching her attention. It wasn't obvious, just a feeling that came from hours of learning to read landscapes and human behavior through a rifle scope. She had tried to mention her observations to Kelly twice, but he had dismissed her concerns with the kind of casual authority that came naturally to him. Sarah was backup, after all. Her job was to watch his 6 and take over only if something happened to him. Her job was not to make strategic observations or question the assessment of more experienced soldiers. The thing about being invisible, though, was that it gave you time to watch and learn. While Kelly was focused on the areas highlighted in their briefing, Sarah had been studying the entire valley, noting patterns of movement, identifying potential hiding spots, cataloging every detail that might become important. She had developed her own system of observation that went beyond the standard protocols, a methodical approach that treated every shadow as potentially significant. Her childhood had taught her that being overlooked meant being underestimated, and being underestimated meant that people revealed things around you they might otherwise keep hidden. In her family, she had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded arguments, to sense when her father had had a particularly bad day at work, to know which of her siblings was likely to get in trouble before they even realized it themselves. Those skills had translated surprisingly well to military reconnaissance. The monastery continued to nag at her attention. There was something about the way the shadows fell around it that didn't match the supposed abandonment. Abandoned buildings had a certain quality of stillness, a complete lack of the tiny movements that indicated human presence. But this building felt occupied. Not obviously, not in any way that would show up in standard reconnaissance, but there were subtle signs that her instincts had learned to recognize. Kelly was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of activity in their assigned sector. She could hear it in his breathing, see it in the slight tension in his shoulders. He was a soldier who thrived on action, who needed to feel useful and important. Sitting on a ridge watching empty landscape was torture for someone like him. For Sarah, though, this kind of patient observation was almost meditative. She had spent countless childhood hours in the woods behind her house, watching deer and learning to move so quietly that wildlife would ignore her presence. She had discovered that if you could make yourself still enough, patient enough, invisible enough, the world would reveal its secrets to you. The radio crackled with an update from command. The patrol in the valley was approaching the monastery sector in approximately 20 minutes. All overwatch positions were to maintain heightened alertness. Kelly immediately perked up, finally, having something concrete to focus on. But Sarah was already focused. She had been watching the monastery for over an hour, and she was now certain that it wasn't as abandoned as the intelligence reports claimed. There were signs, a barely perceptible movement in one of the upper windows, a pattern in the birds that suggested they were avoiding the area, and, most tellingly, a complete absence of the small animals that should have been visible around a truly empty building. She tried once more to share her observations with Kelly, but he was now completely absorbed in preparing for the patrol's arrival, checking and rechecking his equipment, adjusting his position for what he assumed would be his moment to prove his worth. Sarah made a decision that went against every protocol she had been taught. She shifted her scope to maintain a constant watch on the monastery while Kelly focused on the patrol route. If she was right about the building, the patrol was walking into a trap. If she was wrong, the worst thing that would happen was that she would continue to be invisible and irrelevant. Through her scope, she watched the patrol emerge from the tree line and begin their approach across the open ground toward the village. They moved with the confident casualness of soldiers who believed their overwatch had cleared the area. 12 men walking across open ground, trusting that the eyes on the ridges would keep them safe. The monastery remained still, but Sarah's instincts were screaming now. Something was wrong. Something was about to happen. And, despite every training exercise that had taught her to stay in her lane, to follow orders, to remain backup until called upon, she found herself making minute adjustments to her rifle position. Kelly was focused entirely on the patrol, providing the standard overwatch that their mission called for. His scope tracked the soldiers as they moved, ready to provide cover if needed. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, following protocol perfectly. Sarah was doing something different. She was trusting her instincts over her training, her observations over her orders. Her scope remained fixed on that monastery window, on the shadow that had moved just slightly more than shadows should move. The patrol was now halfway across the open ground. Kelly was reporting their progress over the radio, his voice steady and professional. Alpha and Bravo teams were confirming clear sightlines. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Except for the monastery. Except for the feeling in Sarah's chest that something was about to go very, very wrong. Except for the barely visible movement in that upper window that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. The patrol continued their advance, and Sarah held her breath, her finger hovering near her trigger, waiting for something she couldn't quite name but knew in her bones was coming. This was the moment when being backup, being invisible, being overlooked might actually matter for the first time in her life. This was the moment when 3 years of being underestimated were about to collide with a split second when visibility might mean the difference between life and death for 12 men who had no idea they were walking into danger. The shot came from the monastery at 0847 hours, just as Sarah's instincts had warned her it would. The sound cracked across the valley like thunder, and immediately the patrol below scattered for cover. One of the men dropped, and Sarah could see through her scope that he wasn't getting back up. Kelly was already radioing for medical evacuation and calling out target information, but his scope was trained on the wrong building entirely. Sniper fire from the eastern structure, Kelly reported, his voice tight with adrenaline. Patrol has 1 man down, requesting immediate suppression. Sarah knew he was wrong. The shot had come from the monastery, not the eastern building. She had watched the muzzle flash, had seen the brief glint of sunlight on metal from that upper window she had been monitoring. But protocol demanded that she support Kelly's assessment unless she had irrefutable evidence to contradict him. Through her earpiece, she could hear chaos erupting across all channels. Alpha team was repositioning to engage the eastern building. Bravo team was trying to get a visual on the reported sniper position. Command was coordinating the medical evacuation for the wounded soldier. Everyone was reacting to Kelly's report, and everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The monastery had gone completely still again, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Whoever had fired that shot was skilled enough to disappear immediately after taking it, which meant they were skilled enough to take another one as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her 6 months ago. She keyed her radio on a direct channel to Kelly, bypassing the main communication network. Kelly, the shot came from the monastery. Grid reference 7-4-2-1. Upper window, southwest corner. Kelly's response was immediate and dismissive. Negative, Martinez. I have visual on muzzle flash from Eastern Building. Maintain your sector. But Sarah had spent 3 years learning to read people as carefully as she read landscapes, and she could hear something in Kelly's voice that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. She could hear the fear of being wrong, the unwillingness to admit that his backup might have better information than he did. The patrol was still pinned down in the open ground, using whatever cover they could find. The wounded soldier was being dragged toward a depression in the earth that offered minimal protection, but they needed suppression fire on the actual sniper position before they could safely move him to proper cover. Alpha Team was already engaging the Eastern Building, their rounds impacting against stone and mortar in a display of firepower that would have been impressive if it had been directed at the right target. The real sniper was watching all of this unfold from the monastery, probably selecting his next target with calm deliberation. Sarah found herself in a position she had never imagined facing. She could see the actual threat clearly. She had the training and equipment to neutralize it. But she was backup, and backup soldiers didn't make independent tactical decisions, especially when they contradicted the primary sniper's assessment. Her scope was locked onto the monastery window. She had adjusted for wind and distance. Her breathing was controlled. Her position was stable. She had a clear shot at the area where the enemy sniper would have to appear if he wanted to engage the patrol again. The problem was that taking that shot would mean acting outside the chain of command. It would mean contradicting Kelly's assessment publicly. It would mean stepping out of the invisible role she had played her entire life. Through her scope, she saw movement in the monastery window again. A glint of metal, a shadow shifting position. The enemy sniper was preparing for his second shot, and, from his position he would have a clear line of fire to the depression where the wounded soldier was being treated. Kelly was still directing Alpha Team's fire toward the Eastern Building, his voice growing more frustrated as they failed to suppress a sniper who wasn't there. The patrol was calling for immediate support, their voices tight with the desperation of men trapped in open ground with limited cover. Sarah's finger moved to her trigger. Every aspect of her training told her to wait for orders. Every instinct she had developed told her that waiting would cost lives. She thought about her childhood, about all the times she had seen problems developing and had known exactly how to prevent them, but had stayed quiet because that was her role. The time her brother Jake was heading for a fight that would get him expelled, and she had known exactly which words would defuse the situation, but had said nothing because drawing attention to herself felt more frightening than letting the disaster unfold. The time her sister Emma was making a decision about a boyfriend that Sarah could see would end badly, and she had watched silently as the relationship imploded exactly as she had predicted. Being invisible had taught her to see clearly, but it had also taught her to remain passive in the face of that clarity. She had become an expert at knowing what needed to be done and finding reasons not to do it. The monastery window showed movement again, more deliberate this time. The enemy sniper was settling into position for his next shot. Sarah could see the angle of his position, could calculate where he was aiming. The wounded soldier was directly in his line of fire. Kelly's voice came over the radio again, calling for more fire on the Eastern Building. Alpha Team was complying, but their ammunition was finite and their position was becoming exposed as they focused on the wrong target. The real enemy was watching all of this unfold, probably amazed at how a single misdirected shot had caused an entire unit to waste their resources attacking an empty building. Sarah made a calculation that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with the mathematics of survival. 12 men were in danger. One of them was already wounded. The longer the real sniper remained unengaged, the more casualties they would take. Kelly's pride and her own invisibility were luxuries they couldn't afford. She centered her crosshairs on the monastery window and began her breathing routine. The enemy sniper was there, she was certain of it. She couldn't see him clearly, he was too well concealed for that, but she knew exactly where he had to be based on the angle of the shot and the limitations of the building's architecture. The radio chatter continued around her, a symphony of confusion and misdirected effort. Kelly was becoming increasingly agitated as Alpha Team failed to suppress the non-existent sniper. Command was demanding updates that no one could provide accurately. The patrol was requesting immediate assistance that wasn't coming. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her, the same feeling she had experienced as a child when she would disappear into the woods for hours, becoming so still that deer would graze within arm's reach of her hiding spot. This was what she was good at. This was what all those years of being overlooked had prepared her for. She took the shot at 0853 hours. The sound of her rifle firing was immediately followed by the distinctive crack of a bullet impacting stone and flesh. Through her scope, she saw a figure tumble away from the monastery window, saw a rifle clatter down the steep monastery roof and fall into the courtyard below. For a moment, the radio channels went completely silent. Then, Kelly's voice, tight with disbelief, "Martinez, did you just fire?" Before Sarah could respond, the patrol leader's voice cut through the channel, "Sniper down." Repeat, "Sniper down." Threat neutralized. Alpha Team immediately ceased fire on the eastern building. Bravo Team was repositioning to provide overwatch for the medical evacuation. Command was demanding clarification on what had just happened. And General Morrison, who had been monitoring the operation from the Tactical Operations Center, asked the question that would change everything: who fired that shot? Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the fact that her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Backup Sniper Martinez, sir. Enemy neutralized from grid reference 7-4-2-1. There was a pause that felt like it lasted forever. Then, the general's voice, crisp and clear: "Outstanding work, Martinez." "Kelly, what's your status?" Kelly's response was barely audible: "Backup sniper made the call, sir. Target was not in my sector." Sarah lay on that cold ridge, her rifle still trained on the monastery, and realized that everything had just changed. For the first time in her life, being invisible had not been an option. For the first time in her life, the consequences of staying hidden had been too high to accept. The patrol was already moving to secure the monastery and recover the enemy sniper's body. The wounded soldier was being evacuated successfully. The mission was proceeding according to plan, except that the plan had been wrong and she had been the one to correct it. As she began to pack her equipment, Sarah noticed that her hands were completely steady. 3 years of training had prepared her for this moment, but 24 years of being overlooked had prepared her for what came next: the attention, the questions, the scrutiny of people who had never bothered to notice her before. The girl who had always been backup was about to discover what it meant to be primary. The debriefing session that afternoon felt like being trapped under a microscope. Sarah sat at a metal table in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by officers whose names she had only heard in passing during her 3 years of service. General Morrison sat directly across from her, his weathered face unreadable as he reviewed the mission reports. She had never been in a room where she was the primary focus of attention, and the experience was overwhelming. Every question felt like a test she hadn't studied for. Every pause in conversation seemed to demand explanation. After years of existing on the periphery, suddenly, being at the center was like staring directly into the sun. "Tell me about your observation of the monastery," General Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior officers stand straighter. "When did you first identify it as a potential threat?" Sarah found herself struggling with how much detail to provide. In her usual role as backup, her observations had been dismissed or ignored so consistently that she had stopped articulating them with any expectation of being heard. Now, with a room full of senior officers hanging on her every word, she wasn't sure how to calibrate her response. "Sir, I noticed inconsistencies in the building's appearance approximately 90 minutes before the engagement. The intelligence report listed it as abandoned, but the wildlife behavior in the area suggested active human presence." Colonel Hayes, the battalion commander, leaned forward. "Wildlife behavior? Explain." This was exactly the kind of detail that Kelly would have rolled his eyes at, the type of observation that branded her as overthinking in the minds of her peers. But now, with 12 lives saved and an enemy sniper eliminated, these details were suddenly being treated as tactical intelligence. Birds were avoiding the area around the monastery, sir. Not just flying around it, but maintaining a clear perimeter. In truly abandoned structures, wildlife typically moves freely through and around buildings. The avoidance pattern suggested recent and ongoing human activity. General Morrison made a note in his folder. "And you communicated these observations to Sergeant Kelly?" The question felt like walking through a minefield. She could protect Kelly by saying he had been focused on his assigned sector, or she could tell the truth about how her observations had been dismissed. Either choice would define not just her future but potentially Kelly's as well. "I attempted to share my observations, sir. Sergeant Kelly determined that our assigned sector took priority." It was a diplomatic answer, but General Morrison's expression suggested he understood exactly what had happened. He had probably been in the military long enough to recognize the dynamics between primary and backup personnel, the way information flowed upward or got filtered out depending on personalities and protocols. Walk me through your decision to engage the target. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Military protocol was clear: backup personnel engaged only when ordered or when the primary was incapacitated. She had violated that protocol, and, while the outcome had been positive, the military had court-martialed soldiers for less significant breaches of command structure. "Sir, I observed muzzle flash from the monastery window during the initial engagement." Sergeant Kelly identified the source as the Eastern Building and directed Alpha Team's response accordingly. "I maintained surveillance on the monastery and identified preparations for a second shot directed at our wounded personnel." "And you decided to engage without authorization." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt the weight of every person in the room watching her response. This was the moment when her military career would either advance or end, depending on how she explained a decision that had saved lives but violated the chain of command. "Sir, I assessed that immediate engagement was necessary to prevent additional casualties. The wounded soldier was in the direct line of fire from the monastery position, and Alpha Team's suppression efforts were focused on an incorrect target." General Morrison closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. The silence stretched long enough that Sarah began to wonder if she should add something more, some justification or explanation that would make her decision sound less like insubordination. "Private Martinez," he said finally, "in my 30 years of military service, I have encountered very few soldiers who possess both the observational skills to identify threats that others miss and the initiative to act on those observations when protocols suggest otherwise." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She couldn't tell if this was leading toward commendation or court-martial. The challenge with exceptional soldiers is that they don't fit neatly into standard military structures. They see what others don't see, they know what others don't know, and they're willing to act when others hesitate. These qualities make them invaluable in combat situations and extremely difficult to manage in peacetime. Colonel Hayes shifted in his chair. "General, if I may, Private Martinez's actions today were clearly outside established protocol." "They were," General Morrison agreed. "They were also correct. And, if she had followed protocol, we would be evacuating casualties instead of celebrating a successful mission." He stood up, and everyone in the room immediately followed suit. Sarah's heart was beating so fast she worried it might be audible. "Private Martinez, you're being transferred to the Advanced Reconnaissance School at Fort Benning. Upon completion, you'll be assigned to a specialized observation unit where your particular skills can be properly utilized." The words felt surreal. Sarah had spent 3 years as backup, as support, as the person who carried equipment and followed orders. The idea of being assigned to a specialized unit, of being recognized for the very qualities that had kept her invisible, was almost impossible to process. "Sir," she managed, "thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," General Morrison said with something that might have been a smile. "Advanced reconnaissance training has a 40% graduation rate. And the specialized units don't have backup positions. Everyone is primary, everyone is responsible for their own decisions, and everyone lives with the consequences of those decisions." As the debriefing ended and the officers filed out, Sarah remained standing at attention, trying to understand what had just happened to her life. 3 years of being overlooked had ended with a single shot that changed everything. Later that evening, she sat in the mess hall with Kelly, who had been unusually quiet since the mission ended. The dynamic between them had shifted in ways that neither of them quite knew how to navigate. For 3 years, their roles had been clearly defined. Now those definitions had been shattered. "You knew," Kelly said finally. "You knew the whole time where the shooter was." Sarah stirred her coffee and tried to find words that wouldn't sound like accusation or triumph. "I suspected. I couldn't be certain until he fired. But, you tried to tell me." "I tried to share what I was seeing." Kelly was quiet for a long time, staring at his untouched food. "I've been primary sniper for 5 years," he said. "I've never missed a call like that. I've never been that wrong about a tactical situation." Sarah recognized the tone in his voice because she had heard it in her own internal dialogue so many times. The sound of someone questioning everything they thought they knew about their own competence. "You weren't wrong about the tactical situation," she said carefully. "You were focused on the most likely threat area based on the intelligence briefing. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. And, you were focused on what? It was a genuine question, and Sarah realized that Kelly was trying to understand how she had seen something he had missed. Not with jealousy or resentment, but with the honest curiosity of a professional trying to learn from a mistake. "I was focused on what didn't fit," she said. "The intelligence said the monastery was abandoned, but everything I could observe suggested it wasn't. So I kept watching it even when it wasn't in our primary area of responsibility." Kelly nodded slowly. "That's not something they teach in sniper school." "No. It's something I learned from being invisible for most of my life. When people don't notice you, you get really good at noticing everything else." They sat in silence for a while, both understanding that this conversation was ending one chapter of their relationship and beginning another. Kelly would remain with the unit, would continue to be a primary sniper, would probably become an excellent instructor for the next generation of marksmen. Sarah would go to advanced reconnaissance school and either succeed in a completely new environment or fail spectacularly. "Martinez," Kelly said as they prepared to leave, "for what it's worth, you were never backup material. I just didn't realize it until today." As Sarah walked back to her barracks that night, she thought about the girl who had grown up invisible in a house full of siblings, who had learned to watch and wait and notice things that others missed. That girl was about to become someone entirely new, someone who would be expected to act on her observations instead of keeping them to herself. The transformation had already begun, but Sarah was beginning to understand that becoming visible was only the first step. Learning to be comfortable with that visibility, to make decisions and live with their consequences, to be primary instead of backup in every aspect of her life, that would be the real challenge. The shot that had saved 12 lives had also ended the safety of being overlooked forever. 8 months after that shot changed everything, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez crouched in the ruins of a bombed-out building in Afghanistan, watching 3 insurgent leaders through her scope as they planned an attack on a humanitarian convoy. She was alone on this mission, 200 miles from the nearest friendly unit, with no backup and no one to second-guess her tactical decisions. Advanced Reconnaissance School had been exactly as brutal as General Morrison had warned. Of the 43 soldiers who had started the program with her, only 17 had graduated. The training had stripped away every assumption about military protocol she had ever held and rebuilt her understanding of warfare from the ground up. The program had taught her that exceptional situations required exceptional responses, that rules existed to handle normal circumstances but became limitations when circumstances weren't normal. Most importantly, it had taught her that being right carried just as much responsibility as being wrong, and that the consequences of both followed you forever. Through her earpiece, she could hear the convoy commander reporting their position 20 kilometers away and requesting route clearance. Sarah had been tracking this insurgent cell for 6 days, moving through mountain terrain that would have been challenging for a full squad, gathering intelligence on their plans and capabilities. The 3 men she was watching had spent the morning preparing an improvised explosive device that would destroy the lead vehicle of the humanitarian convoy and block the narrow mountain road. The convoy was carrying medical supplies to a village that had been cut off by fighting for 3 months. 27 aid workers were about to drive directly into a carefully planned ambush. Sarah's mission parameters were clear: observe and report. Gather intelligence on insurgent activities and relay that information to command for appropriate response. She was not authorized to engage unless directly threatened, and she was specifically instructed to avoid any action that might compromise her position or the broader intelligence gathering operation. But Sarah had learned something about herself during those 8 months of training and subsequent missions that she was still coming to terms with. She had learned that she was not capable of watching preventable disasters unfold when she had the power to prevent them. The insurgent leaders were discussing timing and positioning with the calm professionalism of experienced fighters. They had chosen their location perfectly, a narrow pass where the convoy would be moving slowly, with steep terrain on both sides that would prevent escape or evasion. The medical convoy would be trapped like insects in a jar. Sarah activated her radio and contacted the convoy commander directly. "Mercy 6, this is Overwatch. You have hostile contact prepared at grid reference 4-7-2-9. Recommend immediate halt and alternate route." The convoy commander's response was immediate: "Overwatch, negative, alternate route available. Current route is only road capable of handling medical transport vehicles." Sarah looked through her scope at the insurgents, who were now moving the explosive device into position. In 30 minutes, the convoy would round the bend in the road and trigger the device. The narrow pass would become a killing ground, and 27 aid workers would die because they were trying to bring medicine to people who needed it. She made a decision that would probably end her military career and, possibly, her life. Mercy 6, take cover and prepare for engagement. Overwatch is going to clear your route. The convoy commander's voice was sharp with concern. Overwatch, you are not authorized for engagement. Repeat, you do not have authorization to engage. Sarah was already adjusting her position, calculating angles and distances. 3 targets, approximately 400 meters, with limited cover and multiple escape routes. The shot sequence would need to be perfect, because she would only get one opportunity before the survivors scattered. Mercy 6, sometimes authorization comes after successful completion. Beginning engagement in 30 seconds. She thought about the girl who had grown up invisible, who had learned to watch disasters develop and do nothing to prevent them. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered that having the capability to act carried the obligation to act, regardless of protocols or permissions or career consequences. The first shot eliminated the insurgent leader who was positioning the explosive device. The second shot took down the fighter who was moving to a defensive position. The third shot missed as the remaining insurgent dove for cover behind a large boulder. Sarah immediately began moving to a secondary position as the surviving insurgent returned fire. Her location was now compromised, her mission parameters were completely violated, and she was engaged in unauthorized combat with an unknown number of enemy forces in terrain that offered limited concealment. It was exactly the kind of situation that her training had prepared her for and her instincts had always known she would eventually face. The radio crackled with multiple voices as the convoy commander reported the engagement and command demanded clarification on the tactical situation. Sarah ignored the chatter and focused on the immediate problem: one remaining insurgent with unknown capabilities and 27 aid workers who needed that road cleared. She found a new position with better angles and settled into wait. The insurgent was well trained and disciplined, maintaining cover and conserving ammunition. This would be a patience game, and patience had always been Sarah's specialty. Through her scope, she could see movement behind the boulder as the insurgent prepared to change positions. She controlled her breathing and waited for the moment when he would have to expose himself to move to better cover. The shot came 40 minutes later, when the insurgent finally attempted to retreat toward higher ground. Sarah's bullet caught him halfway between cover points, ending the engagement and clearing the road for the medical convoy. The aftermath was complicated in ways that her training hadn't fully prepared her for. Command was furious about her unauthorized engagement. The convoy reached the village safely and delivered medical supplies that saved dozens of lives. Sarah was simultaneously recommended for commendation and court-martial proceedings. General Morrison flew to her position for the debriefing, arriving in the same helicopter that evacuated her from the mountain. As they flew over terrain that she had been studying through a rifle scope for 6 days, he asked her the question she had been expecting. "Martinez, you violated direct orders by engaging those targets. You compromised an ongoing intelligence operation and put yourself at unnecessary risk. Explain your decision." Sarah looked down at the village where the medical convoy was already unloading supplies, at the road where 3 insurgents had planned to kill 27 aid workers, at the mountains where she had spent 6 days learning that being capable of preventing disasters meant being responsible for preventing disasters. "Sir, I assessed that following orders would result in preventable casualties. I chose to accept responsibility for the consequences of engagement rather than the consequences of inaction." General Morrison was quiet for a long time as the helicopter carried them toward base. Finally, he spoke over the noise of the rotors. "Martinez, you're being reassigned to a joint task force that specializes in situations where normal protocols don't apply. Situations that require soldiers who can make correct decisions without authorization, who can accept responsibility for outcomes that others might try to avoid." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and terror. Each promotion, each new assignment, each recognition of her capabilities took her further from the safety of being invisible and deeper into the territory where every decision carried life or death consequences. "The position comes with a new rank and a warning," General Morrison continued. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, you will never be back up again. Every mission will require you to make decisions that other people are unwilling or unable to make. Every decision will have consequences that you'll live with forever." As the helicopter approached the landing zone, Sarah thought about the path that had led her from the invisible middle child to a soldier who was being asked to make impossible decisions in impossible situations. She thought about Kelly, who had taught her that being primary meant more than just taking the first shot. She thought about the convoy of aid workers who would go home to their families because she had chosen action over protocol. Most of all, she thought about the girl on the ridge who had been only backup until a general asked who fired that shot. That girl had discovered that invisibility was a luxury she could no longer afford, and that stepping into the light meant accepting responsibility for everything that light revealed. The helicopter touched down, and Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez stepped out into her new life as someone who would never again have the option of being overlooked, ignored, or relegated to backup status. She had become exactly what the military needed, a soldier who could see what others missed and act when others hesitated. But, more than that, she had become someone who could live with the weight of those actions, who could accept the responsibility that came with capability, who could make peace with being visible in a world that often preferred its heroes to remain in the shadows. The girl who had once been only backup was now primary in every sense of the word, and she had discovered that stepping into that role meant carrying not just the authority to make decisions, but the burden of living with every consequence of those decisions for the rest of her life. It was a burden she had learned to carry, and a responsibility she had discovered she was uniquely qualified to bear.